Hey everyone, welcome back to the Light Up Your Metabolism podcast. My guest today, Zaid Dahhaj, and I are going to speak all about how the skin is impacted by the sun. This is one of, I think, the most controversial areas, and I was so happy to get Zaid on the podcast to talk about this subject. He posts a lot of things about, a lot of studies actually about the sun and skin health on his Instagram channel, so make sure you follow him over there. I'm going to put all his links in the show notes in the description below the video. And in this conversation, we're going to talk about the dangers of actually staying out of the sun and also how we can protect the sun, but there's a lot of unlearning we need to do when it comes to UV light and melanin and the skin. So we're going to dive into the relationship between light and melanin, specifically the impact of blue light on the skin and natural sunlight on skin health. And we're also going to talk about other areas as well, such as eye health, and we're going to talk about sunglasses and sunscreen. And then we dive into a lot of different areas: EMF exposure, wired headphones. I talked about that last week on the podcast with Daniel DeBron from Defender Shield. So this episode is chock full of information that is going to be really helpful and also help to open your mind and maybe unlearn certain things that may have been preventing you from doing certain things that are health promoting, right? So let me tell you a little bit more about Zaid before we dive in. He is an obsessed practitioner of circadian biology who has dedicated the last few years of his life to learning about all things circadian biology, sunlight, and everything in between. He works as a circadian optimization coach at DexafitOC in Irvine, California, along with their parent company, the Meta Warrior. He's helped thousands of people to develop a healthier relationship with light and dark cycles through education, and you can find him on Instagram at Zaid K Dahhaj and also on X or Twitter as well. And so I just wanted to quickly shout out my sponsors for today's episode and say thank you so much to them for sponsoring the show. Thank you to you guys for using my links and codes, and that's an amazing way to support my small business. And another amazing free way to support this podcast, this channel, is to simply subscribe, like, rate, leave a review, leave a comment. If you're watching this on YouTube, all of those things really help the show to grow, and they mean so much to me, and they also help me to be able to continue putting out really high quality free content for all of you so you can keep improving your health, learning more, and feeling amazing. So thank you again. I really appreciate it, and let's dive into the interview with Zaid. I want to start by reading a quote from my guest today, Zaid Dahhaj, and this is what it says. And you guys, okay, there's no curses in this one. Okay, sometimes there's curses in them. Okay, so it says, "We must remain grounded in our understanding that nature is a source of infinite wisdom. Humanity stands above the rest as the greatest species on the planet, but that accolade quickly goes to shit," there it is, "when we believe that we can divorce ourselves from the natural world. That is the type of thinking which leads to our great fall off the evolutionary ladder. We become drunk on our own foolishness. We lose touch with the fact that every aspect of our being is rooted in nature, in the same way a tree is rooted to the earth. We become a shell of ourselves, and so the only way we can mend this existential wound is through a reintegration of the mind, body, and spirit to the land. It necessitates that we place the nature back into human nature." I love that quote. Zaid, welcome to the show.
Thank you. I appreciate it. You got a good tweet there, because I remember when I wrote it a couple days back. I was by the fireplace, and I think the whole thing with the writing is to just get some free flow going and really just share your message. So I appreciate you reading that out.
Yeah, I have these moments too where it's like I feel like I need to be tweeting or typing, sharing these existential moments that you have when you are connected to nature. I've never had more profound thoughts and been on just feeling so deeply connected to my own spirituality as I have since being more in nature, in touch with the sun. And I can see I'm you're nodding your head, so I feel that maybe you agree. Do you
Oh
feel the
yeah,
same?
and it speaks to the root of human biology and where we came from as a species. I think that a lot of the problem with society today is that we are divorced from nature. I mean, we're about as far divorced as we can be. If we're talking about the way our food is grown, the fact that we spend 90+% of our time indoors, and it really speaks to, I guess, the popular conventional narrative today. It's just nature is not included in that discussion, which I think the both of us are trying to inject that back into the whole conversation here.
Yeah, injecting nature back into our healing protocols. So why do you think that, I mean, why isn't nature and the sun and circadian biology included in the narrative, even in the holistic and naturopathic functional spaces? Like, why is this missing and what harm is this doing? Can you hear me, Zaid?
Oh yeah, I think you cut out there a little.
Okay, so I'll repeat my question. So, why do you think that even in these holistic, functional, naturopathic spaces, are we not talking about circadian and quantum biology? Is it that we just never knew? What is happening? Why are we missing this? And why are we just like beating that dead horse of, diet and exercise?
It's a good question. So I think from the standpoint of centralized medicine, it's a pretty easy answer if you understand a little bit of the history behind it. So something that I always point to is like the Flexner report in the early 1900s. You have Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, Flexner himself, and really a lot of these guys were basically drunk on greed and power. And as a result, they wanted to control medicine and create it into their own sort of framework. So if you take a look at the way that they influence the medical system, that plays a big role in the fact that we're not talking about sunlight, certainly not talking about circadian biology, especially if you're just your average physician, MD, ophthalmologist, dermatologist, whatnot. So I think that's a relatively simple answer. And then, of course, you have the whole idea of the sun being bad. I think that's part and parcel of the standard narrative. But if you look at the more interesting question here, which is why are holistic communities or naturopathic, functional medicine not covering this? I just think at the end of the day, it is a very niche subject, and it does take some experience in the health realm to then find yourself at this point where you start to understand human biology at a deeper level as it relates to light. Because, of course, everyone is obsessed with nutrition or exercise, supplementation, detox. But again, that's surface level. If we're looking at the ground, if we're looking at the fundamental of the human body and how it operates, I really do believe that it's light. And all of those things that we talk about, whether it's nutrition or exercise, they tie directly into the discussion of light. And I would argue that they're fundamentally controlled by light itself. So, and there are probably other reasons as well, but I think that's the root cause.
Wow. So let's dive into light. So how, on a fundamental level, what are these smallest particles? Like, how can we hit that root cause that, we're talking? It's like I was taught that, looking at the adrenals is a root cause approach, or looking at my hormones or my blood sugar is a root cause approach, but there's a rootier root cause. So, can you talk to us about, just sort of introduce that topic of how light is so um, powerful and its deep impacts on our human physiology?
Yeah, so you hear a lot of people throwing the term quantum biology around. I do think that there's a lot of merit to that. But again, like if anyone says that they understand quantum physics or quantum mechanics, I mean, you could just take the words of Feynman on this. Like they really don't understand it if they do think that. So this stuff is extremely complicated. I mean, it can go over your head very quickly if you start to dive into the details. But reality is based on three fundamental aspects. Actually, four or five if you look at all of them. So you have electrons, protons, neutrons, then you have hydrogen, and then deuterium. So these subatomic particles make up all of existence, and they certainly make up the human body as a whole. And so when we start to talk about the interaction of light, grounding, a lot of these fundamental practices in relation to those subatomic particles, you begin to realize that they are married. They cannot be divorced from one another. And I think that if it is valuable to look at the adrenals or the kidney, the liver, all of that stuff, because that is a part of the equation. But like you said, there is a deeper level to this game. And if you really dive deep into it, then you'll find yourself at the intersection of, quantum biology, biophysics, and whatnot.
Yeah. So I'm drinking hydrogen water as we speak. So, how I saw you post about how, for example, like steroid hormones have receptors for light. So, can you talk to us about how the human body actually has been designed to receive the light and how it influences the body?
Yeah, so this is something I recently came across. The idea that steroid hormones, every steroid hormone, by the way, is tied to light directly. So if you look at the specific nanometer length, this is how we measure light. Then you start to dive into an interesting rabbit hole where you see that pregnenolone, estradiol, testosterone, DHT, all of these hormones sense light, UV light more specifically, at a very specific wavelength. And they differ, but they have a lot of similarities in terms of what wavelength we're talking about. But what's interesting, and what I find the most interesting actually, is that most of them sense UV light under the range of UVA and UVB. So this gets into the discussion of biophotons. Like if you look across all steroid hormones, we're talking, 100 to maybe 180 nanometers, and that's not what you find with UVA and UVB. I believe UVA is like 300 to 400, something around those lines. UVB is 280 at the lowest. So we get into the discussion of biophotons. In other words, the light that your body produces from within. So every cell and tissue in the body actually emits a certain frequency of light under all circumstances, really. And biophoton emission is not pseudoscience, which is what I hear from a lot of people. There's quite a robust literature on it, and we can actually measure this through very specific scientific means. So that's what I'm pointing to. It's like, you have the fundamental layer, which is like you're focused on sunlight, UVA, UVB, blue light, all of these other wavelengths. But then we also have to talk about the light show within us, which people like Dr. Jack Kruse has covered in depth. And honestly, he's probably the one who's covered it best in terms of its complexity.
Mhm.
But again, it's important to understand that steroid hormones are fundamentally tied with light. You just can't escape that.
Wow. So how does the body sense light just in general? And what light specifically is helping us to kind of keep track of, what time it is, that circadian clock?
So the body senses light through these light sensitive opsins known as non-visual photoreceptors. So these are proteins that are tied to light directly, but they also have light. They also have functions that are independent of light. So they don't just deal with light; they deal with other things as well in the body. But there are a few examples. You have neuropsin, which detects UVA from the sun. You have rhodopsin, which is more responsible for sensing greenish light wavelengths, responsible for low lit environment, sight, and whatnot. And then I think the most important one to point out is melanopsin, which is actually the number one most dominant chromophore in the body. So, I mean, point to any place in the body, you can find melanopsin there. The subcutaneous fat, the brain, the eyes, the blood vessels, and in many other places as well. So a lot of this dysfunction that we're seeing because of our current light environment of artificially blue light and whatnot is mainly acting through the melanopsin pathway.
So
It's
melanopsin, what light does it detect? Just so people know.
yeah, completely forgot that, but blue light sensor. So it senses light I believe between 420 to 480 nanometers.
Yeah.
And this is an important discussion if we consider that our environment is lit up with artificial blue. And it's also an important discussion when we talk about the full light spectrum from the sun, especially natural blue light versus artificial blue light.
Right. So a lot of people are like, okay, if blue light is bad and there's blue light in the sun, should I not be outside, or should I not have blue light when it's daytime? So can you help clear some confusion on this?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of confusion on this. I think it's one of the most controversial subjects within this realm. Um, but basically, when you're talking about artificial light within our environment, you're talking about a light spectrum that is alien in nature. I mean, it's just not found anywhere in nature, actually, because you have a large spike of blue, you don't have any red or infrared, and then, of course, you don't have any UVA, UVB, and the other light wavelengths. But the thing about blue light, when it comes from the sun, is, and this is the important distinction, it comes packaged with all of the other light wavelengths. And to a species that evolved under the full light spectrum from the sun, this is an important consideration. I mean, obviously, we we evolved with blue light in its natural setting. And if you go through the literature, you can actually find a lot of evidence showing that blue light in and of itself from a natural source has all sorts of positive systemic function. I mean, there was a study I recently came across that actually showed that blue light in and of itself can actually increase the rate at which fat cells burn fat, and they can also decrease the size of a fat cell, an adipocyte. And so that's why I usually come across people who report that they are actually leaner once they start implementing a sunbathing practice.
Yeah, there's a lot of things that also help fat burning. I think with melanin, with the UVA light, I believe that increases lipolysis, and UVB light, I think, helps with fat burning too. So a lot of these amazing properties of the sun are really helping with our metabolic health and fat burning and stuff. So talk to us about blue light at night, and or blue light that's artificial, and this isolated blue light, and what's wrong with it, like what's happening when we're exposing our body to the blue light when it's not the right time of day or night for it.
Well, at the root cause, we're talking about circadian disruption. And if you go through the literature, you go through PubMed, various other databases that have a lot of other journals and scientific evidence, you'll find that circadian disruption is probably the worst thing for a human being. I mean, it makes sense too, because we are circadian creatures and we work in tandem with light. So when we're talking about what artificial light does to the body in general, we can start with the fact that circadian disruption touches every aspect of the body in a negative way. And in my opinion, I really do think that it can independently cause various chronic diseases that you find in our environment. I mean, you could talk about heart disease, cancer, melanoma, I mean, various things that we can touch on. But you have the circadian disruption. And then again, because we are just exposed to a spike of blue, especially after sunset when we're not supposed to sense that type of light, then we can get into the damage that this causes to not only the eyes, but the skin, the brain, and really just, like I said, every other aspect of the body, because this is so universal to how we evolved.
Right. So what's that mechanism that the blue light is, like, what is it doing to our bodies?
Well, first of all, it's activating melanopsin at the wrong time,
Hmm.
pointing to the circadian disruption. And then I think another important thing is that it destroys the mitochondria altogether. Most people think of it as the powerhouse of the cell, yes, but it's really tied to every aspect of our physiology, especially the epigenetic aspect of things, what we do with our lifestyle. And so if you destroy the mitochondria, you can go through the literature and find that mental illness is directly tied to mitochondrial dysfunction, heart disease, cancer, type 2 diabetes, I can go on. But another consideration is that it actually destroys those non-visual photoreceptors that I mentioned earlier, those opsins that are designed to sense light. And when you destroy that, then you set yourself up for some serious problems when it comes to specific areas of the brain, like the hypothalamus, the suprachiasmatic nucleus, the habenula nucleus, which is largely responsible for executive function, addiction, obesity, and then all of the manifestations that come with that. So basically, it's destroying every aspect of the body, also including melanin, which then has a systemic effect over the long term.
So talk to us about melanin if people are unfamiliar with it.
So melanin is Mother Nature's most powerful polymer. I mean, it's found all throughout nature. You have three various forms of melanin. Neuromelanin is found in the brain. As human beings, we are actually, I believe, the one species that have neuromelanin, which makes us distinct in many ways. And then you have pheomelanin, which is responsible for the reds, oranges, yellows in nature. Think of a flamingo pink, think of a red fox. And then you have eumelanin, which is responsible for the blacks and browns. Think of a black panther. Think of someone who is like that stereotypical caramel tan.
Hmm.
So that's how we can differentiate the various forms of melanin. And there are two other ones that don't apply to human biology, but either way, I believe there's about five or six. And then if we're talking about the function of melanin, that's where it gets very exciting, because through the literature, we find it's radioprotective, protects against radiation. It blocks 99% of all UV. It is anti-venom in some cases. It's anti-inflammatory. It acts as an antioxidant. It is even responsible for detoxifying heavy metal ions. So this is why I usually suggest build a tan, which is otherwise known as melanin production, so that you can make the most of your detox pathways. And then there are also a lot of other things. I mean, if you go deeper into it, you could talk about sunlight hitting melanin, which then produces the photoelectric effect that then produces free electrons, which is just very healthy for us in general. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot to it, but again, the literature is full of this. I mean, it's ubiquitous, and it's honestly hard to not see once you do find it.
Yeah, absolutely. So you had a post where you said that UV light from the sun is a hormetic stressor. And I love thinking about it like that, because people, and as you said earlier, that there's this narrative that the sun is bad. And it's like, UV light is bad. It's like, it's not bad. It does have some negative effects, but we could say the same thing about something like exercise, right? It's like, well, exercise increases reactive oxygen species. And if you were to exercise all the time, you'd be breaking down your muscles and you get sore and you could get injured and whatever. It's like, so do we not do we not exercise, right? So this idea of UV light being a hormetic stressor is a really cool way of thinking about it. And for those who don't know, a hormetic stressor is just a stressor that where your body adapts and becomes stronger. So something like cold exposure, saunas, intermittent fasting, exercise, those are hormetic stressors. Can you just expand on that quote where you said that UV light is a hormetic stressor?
Sure thing. So here's the thing that people need to understand. Here's the big differentiator that really needs to get into people's brains. It's when we talk about centralized medicine, especially dermatologists, the way they perceive UVA and UVB is from a reductionist, hyper-reductionist standpoint. So they literally believe that UVA and UVB only serve the function of damaging the human skin and body exclusively, which is outrageous if you go through the literature and actually study this stuff. But to your point about it being UVA and UVB being a hormetic stressor, this is, it's just the process by which your body uses a little bit of stress as an input from the sun to then create biological effects that create a stronger organism, aka better and more robust health. So, I find their argument really disingenuous. I think that it comes from ignorance. It comes from the Flexner report, the influence that had on the centralized education within the medical field. And then, it goes to my other point, which is if we're demonizing the sun so much, which is a hormetic stressor, benefits human health, why are we not doing the same thing on a, population societal level for exercise or cold therapy or sauna, or even the consumption of cruciferous vegetables? I mean, when you eat a cruciferous vegetable, it literally goes through a hormetic stress type of scenario to then benefit the body. So I just think that there are a lot of holes in centralized medicine's understanding of this stuff. And this is probably the most blatant one out there.
Yeah, absolutely. And so when in that post, you started talking about melatonin and melanin being related to the UV light. We already talked about melanin, how your body produces melanin as a response to UV light to protect itself, right? So how is melatonin? They both have the same prefix, I noticed, but they feel like very different hormones to me. Do you know about that? But I'd love to talk about melatonin as well.
I don't think they're too far off. I mean, if you look at the aromatic amino acids, phenylalanine, tryptophan, and then histidine, I believe, tryptophan is responsible for serotonin, which then creates melatonin. And then just above that, you have phenylalanine, which is responsible for tyrosine. And then that eventually creates dopa, which I believe creates melanin. So I'm not surprised that they're similar in that way. But with melatonin, it's, such a fascinating compound and molecule in general. We can talk about the fact that melatonin actually provides an antioxidant effect from sunlight exposure to then, heal the skin and produce some beneficial effects there. We can talk about the fact that it's anti-cancer, antioxidant, anti-inflammatory. Again, like all of these other molecules, it really seems to touch a lot of these things broadly. And so I think the best way to break this down is that there are two forms of melatonin in the body. Centralized medicine usually focuses on the form of melatonin, the circulatory form from the pineal gland, and they only deem it as a hormone of darkness, but it's actually a hormone of light and darkness if you study the other form of melatonin, which is the subcellular form produced from your mitochondria. So again, this is in response to near infrared light from the sun. So it's really like the light and dark cycle are trying to give us robust health and trying to protect us as much as possible in various ways. But I mean, I can't really think of anything else on that. Probably, I would say that's a good descriptor of it for now.
Yeah. And that, just keeping in mind that we make 95% of our melatonin during the day from the sunlight. So what the mainstream medical paradigm is talking about is this 5% of melatonin that's being produced from darkness in the pineal gland. But darkness is important so that we can actually release the subcellular melatonin. That's my understanding. Would you say that's accurate?
I would say to release the circulatory form of melatonin from the pineal gland. And so that is a really great point. Like the majority of your melatonin is produced from daylight, from the mitochondria. And so that really flips the entire narrative on melatonin itself on its head. And I think it's important to understand that the amount of melatonin you actually produce during the day from sunlight exposure, sunbathing more specifically, I mean, it puts the circulatory form from darkness to shame.
Yeah, exactly. So you mentioned dermatologists. So what else? And then I had some questions about just like dermatology and ophthalmology. What are they getting wrong? I mean, I know that we could say like a lot of stuff, but if we could narrow into specifics, or something particular, like what would you say to do differently than a dermatologist would say?
I would say the common thread that dermatologists and ophthalmologists both get wrong is the idea that UV light is just inherently damaging out the gate. That's probably the root cause of it. But if we're talking about more specifics, I mean, you have ophthalmologists who believe that UVA and UVB are bad for the eyes. Now, of course, I'm not recommending that people look directly at the sun anytime outside of sunrise and sunset, aka sun gazing, because that can damage your eyes. But this idea that UV light in general is bad for the eyes is foolish, because there was a particular study that came out a few years ago showing that violet light actually stops myopia altogether through the activation of a gene known as the EGR1 gene. And so, I mean, well, that throws the entire concept that UV light is bad for the eyes out the window. And then you have various things. They recommend sunglasses, which is problematic because you artificially manipulate the full light spectrum in harmful ways. You mess with the sheer complexity of the human body. And then on the dermatologist side, I mean, they say that melanin is a sign of inherent skin damage, which is absurd considering what we just spoke about with melanin. And then various things like sunscreen, sun avoidance, which is outrageous to give that as a recommendation. As a matter of fact, I really do think that it's iatrogenesis at work.
What does that word mean?
For people who are not familiar with iatrogenics, it's basically the idea that a doctor will give you a recommendation, a medical professional will give you a recommendation more than it helps you. And this is a huge problem in the US especially. I believe it's like the third or fourth cause of mortality, I believe mortality overall. So people are dying because of these recommendations from various standpoints. But those are just a few things that come to mind. Yeah, the sunglasses, sunscreen, sun avoidance, contact lenses, LASIK. There's a lot to it that's just really bad.
I got LASIK. I feel very sad about it.
Well, that's fine. I mean, you're not lost. You're not a lost cause at all.
Okay. What do you know? How LASIK impacts you?
It impacts people in different ways. I think my broad recommendation for anybody who's gotten it is to just get more sun and just stay more disciplined with the circadian stuff. But from what I've read, there's a huge problem with the potential destruction of non-visual photoreceptors, because they are actually beaming a form of UV light at 193 nanometers straight into the eye. And then the concern is that it does destroy those opsins, which are intricately tied to the aromatic amino acids, which then produce your neurotransmitters. So this is why we even have some literature on sudden onset suicide, suicidal thoughts. I mean, just out of the blue after LASIK. It's crazy.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I live in sunny places, and I feel like I need to, because I don't feel that I do well. But I've always felt that way. I grew up in New York, and I was depressed every winter, and
Yep.
all that. And I have 2 cloudy days in a row, and I'm like, okay, when's the sun coming back out? Like, I'm very, very sensitive to it, but I feel like I need the sun. So, um, you wrote like heliotherapy on your Instagram bio, and what does that mean? Can you explain that to people?
I mean, the simple breakdown is it's just sun therapy. It's just getting outside, getting your skin and eyes in the game, and really just sunbathing as much as you can in a responsible manner, because this
Hmm.
ties into the idea of a solar callus, which is basically just a tan. And
Hmm.
so once you understand how to build a solar callus, then you have the leverage because you have more melanin to spend as much time as you want in the sun.
Yeah. So, how could you give some steps on how to build the solar callus in a really responsible way?
Absolutely. So the first step is to sunbathe during the morning time. So usually I recommend that people watch sunrise. I think that's a universal recommendation for a lot of the circadian people around here.
Hmm.
But definitely sunbathe in the morning, anywhere between sunrise to around 8 or 9 a.m., depending on your latitude and location. And what that's going to do is it's basically going to prime your skin for the UV that's coming in the midday. And it makes sense from an evolutionary perspective. We did not wear clothing most of the time. We were designed to get most of that light onto our bare skin, and red and infrared light in general have a profound effect on overall skin health. I mean, stimulates collagen production, hyaluronic acid, elastin, filigrein and uracanic acid are two more important ones when it comes to that priming for the UV. But then from that point, just really dosing yourself with midday UV. So getting most of your skin exposed, sunbathing as you would, commonly recognize it, and then doing that progressively. So if you're a lighter skinned individual who burns very quickly, I'd say 5 minutes. If you burn after 5 minutes, I'd say 3 minutes. And so you want to take that sort of intentional approach to it, and then from that point, it's just about consistency. And most importantly, it's also about blocking artificial light, not only during the day, but after sunset, strictly. And
Yeah.
I think that's important because artificial light does damage the skin, making you more susceptible to burns during the day.
Yeah, I want to talk about what do you know about that? Because I feel like people are so adamant about the fact that UV light is damaging to the skin. And it's like, well, what about blue light? I feel that blue light has got to be damaging to the skin. It's very growth promoting, right? So, are there studies that you are familiar with about the effects of artificial light on our skin?
I don't think there's not going to be any direct studies because of the way that centralized medicine is
Hmm.
incentivized, I guess. But you can find various pieces that go to show that it does damage the skin because we know that it damages the brain, certainly. We know that
Hmm.
it damages the eyes. But
Oh,
then,
talk about that.
oh, yeah, so we have to consider that the brain, skin, and eyes are one unit. So when you are an embryo in your mother's womb, the brain, skin, and eyes are made of the same tissue when you are an embryo. So as a result, they work as one unit, and whatever damages them, damages one of them, damages the others. Whatever benefits one of them, benefits the others. So again, this is biology at its finest level. So
Yeah.
if you go through the literature, you will find that artificial light does damage mitochondria. There are mitochondria within the skin. It damages those opsins that are within the skin. So, it just makes sense from a mechanistic perspective as well.
Wow, so interesting. That's I'm like always just so mind blown learning about all
It's
this
crazy.
stuff. So, yeah. So, let's switch gears to talking a little bit more about a different type of frequency that are better known as EMFs or electromagnetic fields or radiation, and especially those that are non-native. So you put a post that like you smashed your AirPods with a hammer, you would never put a cell phone up to your head. Why is this? Like, what is going on here?
So this is going to be very foreign for a lot of people, but we need to couch this in the understanding that the body is electromagnetic first before it is biochemical. So, if we talk about the mitochondria, energy production within the electron transport chain, that's just pointing to the idea that we use electrons, protons, and neutrons for various functions. But
Yeah.
again, electromagnetic first, which means that our system is designed for very specific frequencies from the Earth. You can talk about the Schumann resonance, you can talk about free electrons from grounding, you can even talk about the magnetosphere and things of that nature. But these frequencies affect us, and when we discuss the differentiation between natural frequencies, natural EMFs, and man-made or non-native EMFs, that's the most important thing. So when we're talking about 5G, radio frequencies, magnetic fields that come from unnatural sources, these are huge problems in society that also affect the electromagnetic spectrum. So again, there's a lot we can go into, but as a precautionary principle, it's just a good idea to avoid man-made non-native EMFs as much as possible. Use something called the inverse square law, which dictates that the farther away you get from the source, the bigger the drop off in terms of its potential harm. And I would say a good read on this is Robert O. Becker's book called The Body Electric. It's fantastic when you study the societal history, the fact that the CIA, Department of Defense, a lot of these big conglomerates have known about this work and have actually funded this work. I think it would pique people's interest.
Okay, so let's talk about. You mentioned the further away you can get from these sources, the better. And so, why specifically, for example, AirPods? Like, why would you eat? Like, what are the negative effects of these EMFs on our body? I guess is what I'm asking.
So I had a post about AirPods specifically that went ballistic recently. I think it's just under 2 million views right now, but I got a lot of flack for that. And basically, I was on another podcast discussing the impact that AirPods have when you put it right next to your brain. And so if we're talking about the specific frequency of AirPods, Bluetooth, you're talking about 2.4 gigahertz. That type of non-native EMF is not supposed to be anywhere near your skull. This is why I usually tell people to not take phone calls by putting the phone to their head, because of how these man-made frequencies impact various things like the mitochondria, the melanin that's found in your inner cochlea within your ear canal, and then the melanin that's found in your brain, and then also the opsins as well. So if we're looking at those three fundamental light sensing mechanisms in our body, those are not evolved to withstand non-native EMF. And again, if you're abusing the inverse square law and you have your phone or AirPods right next to your skull for hours on end, that's going to be very problematic. And it manifests itself in the form of the symptoms that people are beginning to experience. Like tinnitus is a huge problem. I've received many comments of people who have started to experience headaches, tinnitus, brain fog, all from simply wearing AirPods consistently. And once they take it away, those symptoms go away. So, it's pointing us in that direction that we should really have some safe practices around non-native EMF and natural EMF as well.
Yeah, so how do you mitigate EMF? What are some strategies that you use, even products, and what have you found to be helpful besides what you said about throwing it away? Like these are EMF free ear headphones, they're wired that I'm using in my head. I have an EMF case. Like what do you do? What do you use? What do you like? What do you know?
So I don't use any non-native EMF blocking products or like the harmonizers or anything like that.
Mm-hmm.
I suggest some very practical things. If you are using AirPods, switch to the Apple wired ones, which are much lower in non-native EMF. They still have an impact, which is why I want to gradually get people away from those. But that is one simple solution that will have, will at least reduce your exposure to these frequencies. And then various things like not keeping your phone in your pockets, any pockets whatsoever. I know a lot of women keep their phone in their bra. Definitely don't do that. Not putting the laptop on your lap, not sleeping with your phone on 5G or Wi-Fi on all night. right next to your head, unplugging a lot of the things from the outlets whenever is possible. And then again, just using the inverse square law, because that's the most foundational piece to this whole discussion. It's just making sure you're in a more natural environment, grounded, which offers protection as well. In nature, getting full spectrum sunlight.
Gotcha. I also turn my my Wi-Fi router off at night to make sure that, you know, I'm reducing that signal, especially as I sleep. Because when we sleep, why is it more important when we sleep to be mitigating or just not having EMFs?
Because that's the only and most fundamental way that you actually heal a body. I mean, sleep, deep sleep, REM sleep. Talk about circadian cycles, the increase in melatonin after sunset. It's just full blown regeneration on steroids. Which is why if you have inputs in your environment that are messing with that regenerative process, then you're just not recuperating from the daily stress of life, which then opens the door on a long enough time frame for you to develop a chronic disease.
Does the EMF frequency sort of act as a light, because light is also a frequency? So does it impact our circadian rhythms?
It definitely does. So, when it comes to the electromagnetic spectrum, you have sunlight, which is part of the visible spectrum. And then even within sunlight, you have parts that are invisible, like near infrared light. But again, that spectrum is pretty vast. So you can talk about X-rays, gamma rays, Wi-Fi. It crosses a pretty large threshold. But I've even seen some stuff from Cruz when he talks about the fact that non-native EMF can actually mess with how your skin senses full spectrum sunlight. As a result, your sunbathing isn't as powerful in terms of reducing vitamin D3. Like he talks about the idea that you could be tan in a place like, let's say, Malibu, but because there's so much non-native EMF in the environment, and it's traveling all the way to the stratosphere and whatnot, that can impact vitamin D3 synthesis in big ways. So you could have a tan, but your D3 is at like a 30 milligrams per deciliter, which is pretty crazy. Yeah.
I think EMF is a big issue for me where I live. Like there's a tower, like I could see it. It's not the 5G one, but the 5G one's a little bit further. And you know, I'm outside all the time and I'm getting tan all the time and my vitamin D was only 41. And I just, yeah, I feel like there's something happening, whether it's some sort of infection, something. There's something going on, so I need to dig deeper. Maybe it's the Wi-Fi, and I started using. A lot of companies send me a lot of stuff, and I've been hearing some different things about this product. They're EMF rocks, and I was like, let me try it. And over the past 2 days that I've used them, I was skeptical, but I woke up and I did not have brain fog. And I'm like, why am I waking up every day with brain fog? You know, like, so having that tower right there pointing close-ish to my house, I don't know. Like, to be determined. I can't, make a declaration about something after using something for 2 days, but I do feel that EMFs are impacting me in a bigger way that I think, and it's hard because they're everywhere.
It is very difficult to parse truth from falsehood in the beginning. It's a pretty deep rabbit hole, which is why I suggest that people gradually study non-native EMF specifically and EMF in general. But I am by no means an expert in this realm. I think that there are other people who are doing really great work on it, who understand it at a much deeper level.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just pointing to some various things, especially in relation to light, that strike me as interesting in relation
Yeah.
to our overall discussions.
Yeah, no, I think it's interesting, and a lot of people listening to this podcast are beginners in this stuff, so we don't need to go down the whole rabbit hole. But what is something that is really sort of lighting you up lately that you're learning about and you want to share about?
Ooh. Honestly, I think tying into the whole discussion on dermatology is very interesting, because I've been doing a deep dive on various things like acne, just overall skin health in general in relation to sunlight. And some of the literature that's coming out, or that's been out actually, is very interesting. I mean, when I tell you that UVA and blue light, there's literature on both of those wavelengths actually stopping the specific bacteria that causes acne. I find that very interesting. So UVA and blue light specifically will actually stop the specific type of bacteria from producing acne, which is why I've seen a lot of people comment recently on how, like, getting full light spectrum on their bare skin has greatly reduced their acne, or at least even made it go away. And then you have other things like red and near infrared light, which, like I mentioned earlier, can stimulate hyaluronic acid, a big product in the skincare industry today. Collagen, elastin. So people should think about skin elasticity. Elastin's a big part of that equation. And then filigrin, which is a skin protein that hydrates and protects the skin. And then uracanic acid, which shares a lot of the same commonalities as filigrin.
Wow, so interesting. So the idea that before and after exposing our skin to UVB light, we can use red light therapy to help mitigate some of that damage and to get all these amazing things without all the chemicals and the products and all the expense, and we can use, yes, you can buy a red light therapy panel, you can use that, but you can also get it for free right from the sun. So
Yeah.
that's so, so cool. And what would you say is something that you just commonly see people getting wrong, or like a thought that people have that you just want to maybe debunk? And I'll give you an example.
Mm.
I think that a lot of people think that you can get vitamin D anytime you're in the sun. I've heard this quite a bit. So is there something that you feel like people are just missing the boat on, maybe even in who are studying this kind of stuff?
I'll actually go with that one. I think that's a great one. So there are many concepts out here. People who believe that vitamin D supplements are a great replacement for UVB midday sun, which I can explain why that's not the case.
Yeah, please do.
You have people who talk about how you can even, absorb vitamin D if you're in the shade during midday, which I guess that's true to a very small degree because light wavelengths bounce. But again, if they bounce, that means that the intensity of that light wavelength is inevitably going to be scattered and less powerful.
Hmm.
So my philosophy on this is UVB midday sunbathing is the best way to produce vitamin D3, bar none.
Yeah.
Because again, going back to the pathways, vitamin D from a supplement goes through the lipoprotein pathway, which is almost like unaddressed mail. You can go into the work of Dr. Alexander Wunsch for a more in-depth explanation on this, but vitamin D from a pill, it goes through the lipoprotein pathway, which is basically like unaddressed mail that, think about sending an email. You're not going to get it to the place it needs to be because you just don't
Mm,
have the email address correct. But if you look at vitamin D3 from UVB during midday, it goes through the vitamin D protein pathway, which then enacts it to get to the place it needs to go, which is analogous to almost addressed mail. Like you have the person's email, it gets exactly to where it needs to go and does all of its stuff.
gotcha. And there's so many other things that are produced from the sun that we'd be missing out on if we just took that pill. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you're talking about UVA stimulating nitric oxide, lowering blood pressure in the blood vessels and whatnot. UVB, like we said, vitamin D3. But then also with UVA and UVB, you have POMC stimulation, the pro-opiomelanocortin system, which I know you're big on metabolism. That, I mean, it doesn't get as it doesn't get much more fundamental than POMC in relation to metabolism, appetite, fat storage, all that stuff.
Can
And
you
so there is a
explain
lot
that a
that
little bit? Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. Can you explain POMC just a little bit for people who are unfamiliar?
Yeah, no worries. So POMC is it's a pathway in the brain specifically that, when in response to UV light, stimulates a protein also known as POMC, and this protein then gets cut off into a bunch of biological peptide hormones. So these hormones are some of the most powerful ones in nature, but they're responsible for very specific effects. You have beta endorphin and CART. I believe it stands for cocaine and amphetamine related transcription factor peptide. But these are opioid peptides. So if we're talking about mental health, if you're addicted in any sort of way, sunlight is a great avenue to lessen that effect. We're talking about alpha melanocyte stimulating hormone, which is actually where you produce melanin, and a few other ones like lipotropin, ACTH, and CLIP, which are fundamentally tied to insulin and blood sugar and whatnot. But what's interesting about all of these peptide hormones is that they have some very key commonalities. One of them is that all of them are appetite suppressants. So again, talking about obesity or type 2 diabetes, huge problem of overeating in this day and age, that tackles it head on. And then they are also anti-inflammatory, antioxidant. I mean, they're pretty strong in terms of their mechanisms.
So, what light produces POMC?
Technically, UV light. There might be room for other light wavelengths, but I'm not sure on that end. But UVA and UVB certainly.
Okay, awesome. So UVA, UVB, you guys can use that circadian app to find out when the UVA windows are near you. And then, of course, we're going to be using safe sun exposure techniques that Zaid outlined for us and making sure to get that sunrise light first, then the UVA, then the UVB. If you just consume it in chronological order, you're going to do a really good job. And you don't need to be outside all day. Start with little bits. Start with, the best you can do is 5 minutes in the morning. That's better than 0 minutes in the morning, right? So the longer you need to be out there will depend on how sick and dysregulated you are. You may need more and more time, but starting with a little bit can go a really long way. So, all right, Zaid, this has been awesome. Where can people find you, learn more, work with you? What are you working on?
Yeah, so right now I work on the more freelance entrepreneurial end with my own work, but I'm also working with a company called DexafitOC in Irvine here in Southern California, and we just started a parent company called the Meta Warrior. So based off of Plato's ideal citizen, you have an intellectual, but you also have to be somebody who's fit and healthy and whatnot. And so we're doing a lot of exciting stuff there: red light therapy, full spectrum light indoors, talking a lot about this stuff. But other than that, you can find me at Zaid K Dahhaj, ZaidKDahhaj on Instagram and Twitter, also Substack. And then the 2 a.m. podcast is a fun time. So I definitely suggest that people look that up and have a fun time watching.
All right. Well, I will link to everything in the show notes. Thanks so much for being here and for all this great information. It's been fun.
Thank you, Danielle. Appreciate you.